Hello.
Hi,
I'm going to not record for a minute.
because I was thinking on this in the sense that I'm pondering on the fact that, well, the cult of Rome, which is a big thing at the moment in the PKM space anyway, which is sort of people suddenly just rediscovering, well, what they think is hypertext was only part of it. It's sort of shallowness to me is the explicit way in which the linking is done. So they're not necessarily intentional links, but if you do this magic thing, a link is made for you, which seems a very computer sciencey way to think about. That's not really the point. Yes? Yeah, was that an interjection or a?
No. It's
okay, sorry. So to finish out the point, yeah. So that actually, what does matter is why you linked A to B, and the web unintentionally, because of the way it's wandered off to its own corner of hypertextual world, that is sort of in a sense completely lost. And the idea, I must dust off the microcosm stuff again, because one of the marvelous ideas you had there was multiple link bases, and even you could actually reorder the link base stack so that you could basically pull another set of trails, if you will, across the same data set, which to me, actually, the more I think about this now, gets much closer back to the point of what, in their different ways, certainly Bush and Nelson were saying. But Bush's trails were not about making Wikipedia.
Couple of things. Number one, do I look amazing?
Better camera?
No, iPhone.
Oh,
you're doing that? Yeah. That was something that I sort of mentioned. I thought was a really exciting sort of development, is this clip and essentially having the ability to use your phone in this way. I don't know if you know how to use your hands to look at your hands and that sort of that downward thing.
Yeah, I think
that's a really interesting development too.
I've only tried it with you guys now. I didn't do anything. I literally in Zoom, just under video, chose the name of the iPhone. That's what Apple can do. Cool. Two things. Number one, I keep pushing this book and I desperately want you all to buy it and read it. The key thing here is the word is a coordination device. Remember we talked about the bridge on the map? So it's such a brilliant little example. So imagine there's two people who have this map, parachutists, can't communicate, land. Oh, how do I find the other person? Everybody says, let's meet at the bridge. The bridge becomes a coordination device, right? This book basically says language is a coordination device, which is so much more powerful way of looking at than almost anything else, because of the whole context and all of that stuff. The one thing I would really like to discuss in our community is how to connect documents. And by documents, it doesn't have to be a PDF or a big document. It could be a paragraph or a sentence. Because when Mark talked about Rome and all these things, now IA Writer, which is great software, great people, they also have the ability to link between documents. And today I had the Tesla serviced and sitting outside in the heat for a while thinking, okay, I have reader and author, but I don't have a library. So I did the normal thing I've done for 20 years, thinking through designing this and that. And the reason I'm highlighting it now is it's all well and good to have a linked space for yourself. If it really helps you think and find stuff later, great. But if it just helps you put things in, as Mark has highlighted, that it may or may not be useful. But there's the other side of it. If you can't produce something for it, I think it's very underutilized. And so much of the hypertextual stuff assumes that it will be read hypertextually. And unless we can get ACM and equivalent to make that a thing, it's just so theoretical, it's useless. So I think it would be great if one of the next sessions we just decide to talk about, or maybe we all do small presentation in the beginning of this is how we feel document thing should be linked. Does that seem like a good topic?
Yeah, absolutely. I think what Mark was saying about Bush's perspective on what trails are. I mean, my read of Bush's trails was that they're highly qualitative, and they were really specifically about a thing. And so they had they were, you know, Wikipedia links have an aspect of the canonical to them that I think that Bush wouldn't have been interested in. There was very much a specific point of view that one person has in that, and I think that was really interesting as a perspective. Sorry, I didn't realize. I didn't think about it. The fact your hand was on. Go ahead.
Yeah, no, good point. And by the way, Peter, we will address the thing that I emailed you about the law thing later on in a bit.
Very good.
Yeah. Yeah, Mark, sorry.
Yes, I just think when you were talking about displaying things, I something I've been meaning to mention for a few meetings is that I think it was one of your globe demos, I obviously, my usual fat-fingered way, managed to press the wrong button and found myself standing inside the globe, which was interesting. But actually, it made me think that, yes, people, you know, complain about sometimes things being plotted over a globe surface. And I thought, well, actually, here's an interesting thing. Well, if one thing I can do in a VR or AR environment is I can actually look around it, and we can probably even play a bit with the geometry. I mean, it doesn't have to be a particularly, you know, geometric sphere. It could be a bit flattened and things to allow for the space that we, you know, we can't see under our feet and things. But where are that to me begins to map back towards spatial hypertext. What something is where it is. And it doesn't have to have a line, because it knows what it is, because it is where it is. That is why it is there. Now, that's quite a personal thing. And going back to your point about can we share it, that I'd agree becomes problematic. But just in the initial point of in exploration of something where you have a load of things and you do not know what, you may know what the things are as artifacts or subjects or snippets of text or pictures or whatever, but you don't necessarily know the relationship between them. And that's something you are striving to do. Then actually just being able to say, that's one of these and it goes over there. And this is why I think the Omar's presentation really got me thinking, because that falls into the same thing. That I know I've done that, I've done with that, I've labeled that. That is what it needs for now. And that is, in fact, really all I need to do at this point to get on with the process. You know, otherwise the process overtakes from the task that you're trying to do. So instead of trying to understand the sense of what you're looking at, you end up making sure you fill up the right box or you color in the thing the right way. Which is lovely, and it may make a pretty picture, but it won't necessarily yield understanding.
Oh, center stage is doing something.
Yeah.
Talking
Being
of,
able to do those pan and scans.
You're at sea.
talking of only playing with the tool itself, and then, you know, I'm literally just playing with the video. Yeah, good points. So Brandel, one thing that I desperately want now is to use my Quest more. I hardly ever use it. You know, like most people, you get excited. A lot of it has to do with the onboarding, of course, not the first onboarding, that's kind of crap, but that's one thing. But the everyday putting it on, you have to do the zone again and all of that stuff.
Yeah, I actually don't know if Quest 2 is any better, but mine is almost always out of battery whenever I put it on, because
yeah, that too.
It ends up mistaken about whether it's it should be sleeping or not. Yeah, no, it's actually really so as you may imagine, the Silicon Valley is all of the companies are at each other's necks trying to get people. So I've no strangers to Meta recruiters, and so I talk to them, entertain them for a while, for the most part, about like what it is that they think is interesting and what to do. And you know, the recruiters aren't the ones actually at the coalface for doing these things, but their sales pitch is very poor in terms of what it is. And when I say, I actually think text itself, information is really important. Do you have any people doing that? They're like, we have gameplay. I'm just like, yeah, I'm sure you do, but I think text would be more important. And they don't have anything that sounds. They don't have anybody who even can comprehend that as being an important kind of area investigation, which concerns me very deeply.
Yeah,
Not for text, but for them.
that is the key issue. Absolutely. And I think this whole spatial hypertext thing, maybe we can call what we work on in that area hypertextual spatial, hyperspatial textual, hyperspatial text. Over to you, Peter.
Okay. I want to update you on what I've been doing on the Tinderbox side. And originally I had a small Crystal script that was able to access the Tinderbox file and programmatically pull out the values of individual attributes for objects. So the way I used to handle trying to extend Tinderbox was that I'd find all the data that I could conceivably need for whatever external script I was writing. And then I'd pass that all in a call to a shell script function. So the shell script would wind up getting a separate parameter for every single bit of data that was going to be coming in. And I realized this was kind of nuts because it made it very difficult on the Tinderbox side to call out to the shell script, because you basically wound up having to create a template note to construct the command line arguments to your external script, and then run that in order to generate the correct command line and then feed it out to make the actual call. So my epiphany was that all I really need to know is what note I'm starting with when I want to run that script and where the original Tinderbox file is. Then the external script can open the Tinderbox file, look at the node ID, and it makes it very easy to call any script, because now calling any script has the exact same format. It's the location of your current Tinderbox file, which you can get from Tinderbox, and the node ID of your current note, which again is trivial, and you can just form that in a one-liner to call the external script. So I was using Crystal for that, and then I realized that I wasn't completely mirroring how Tinderbox was modeling its data internally. In the Tinderbox database, one thing is every single node has access to all defined attributes. So you basically have sort of like a Google big table representing all conceivable attributes defined on every node, just that a lot of them don't have any instantiation. Then what Tinderbox is actually saving in the data file are the deltas between the individual nodes and the default values of all those attributes, so that it's not storing 500 attributes for every single node if there are only 3 values that are different. When it doesn't find an attribute for the given node, it then follows a prototype chain, and that's sort of the way the Apple Newton operated. And the way JavaScript works, it would follow the prototype chain. So the actual way the Tinderbox determines the value is if it has a local value that's different, it uses that local value. If the value isn't defined on the node, you then look at the node's prototype node. If the prototype has a value defined on it, you use that value. If you don't, you see if the node has a prototype. If it has a prototype, you follow the chain all the way back, however many levels it goes, until you get to a node that doesn't have any prototype. If it doesn't have a value for the attribute, you then look at the attribute's original definition and use the default value for it. And I realized that my original script wasn't doing that. So in order to use my first take of the Crystal script, what you had to do was materialize the values of any attributes that your script was going to care about in the actual node before calling the script, which seemed like a lot of unnecessary work for the user. So then for the current revision, I realized what I have to do is actually model the full Tinderbox lookup mechanism. And I was using the Crystal language for that. But then when I got my M1 Mac, I discovered, much to my horror, that Crystal's built-in XML implementation has a bug in it. And when you're using the XPath API to consult an XML file, if you're on an M1 chip, for some XML files, but not for all, and I have no idea what the tripping point is, it will cause you to get an address error blowing up on the M1 chip. And apparently, having interrogated a whole bunch of forums about it, it's related to how they're calling the dynamic XML lib2 library to do the actual XPath query in Crystal. So I then moved to Ruby, which wouldn't be quite as clean a deployment story for end users, but Ruby is doing most of its work using a compiled gem extension to access the XML file. So speed-wise, it's pretty much a wash. And the Ruby script is going to be just about as fast as a Crystal script. I'll have to benchmark it when I'm all done. But the nice thing is the Ruby API is very close to the Crystal API. The two languages were mirrored after each other. Crystal was essentially intended to be a compiled version of Ruby to begin with. So I was able to move my code from Crystal into Ruby, and using Ruby's Nokogiri gem, I'm able to get at all of the XML data inside of the Tinderbox file. And that actually led me to some interesting corner cases in Tinderbox, because it turns out that Tinderbox theoretically has the ability to link a section of text in a note to a section of text in another note. And the way it does that is the Tinderbox database stores all of the links as separate XML objects, and they have attributes for the source ID of the link, the destination ID of the link, and a dstart or an sstart offset in the case of text links that gets set to, I think it's -1 if it's a web link out that's not connected to the original Tinderbox database. So if you have a sstart and you have a length associated with it, you know that you're actually looking at a link to a text selection in another note. That means that you can pull in the notes text and determine what the actual anchor text is. And I'm going to be exposing that in the API. That's next thing I'm working on this afternoon. So that you'll be able to get at that programmatically. So the end result is you'll be able to interrogate the Tinderbox files in all the ways that matter to you, doing interesting things using the script. And that should open the door for some interesting integration possibilities and extensions. That's actually what I really love most about Tinderbox, in that even though it's a proprietary app and it's not open source in the sense of being open where you can take a look at Tinderbox's source code, it's incredibly open in terms of what you can do with it. If there's anything that the program can't do out of the box, you can still call out to a shell script. The data file is accessible from the external world. So you can do things relatively painlessly to experiment with possible extensions to the program without needing to have access to the internal source code. And I think the open source community sort of missed the boat on that. They got so obsessed with being able to see the original source code of a program that they didn't really think about whether you have the freedom to actually modify and do it in meaningful ways as an end user, as opposed to, well, yes, I can rewrite the internals of the program and recompile it to do what I want slightly differently, when instead it'd be so much easier just to have hooks built into the program to be able to manipulate it externally to achieve the effect you want. And it's more open, even though it's closed, than more open solutions that are more closed in practice.
Yeah.
So that's what's been happening in that project. Also, I should note that about 12:20, I'll have to bow out. There's a book talk being given on the, let's see, what's the title? Design After Capitalism book by Speculative Futures Milan. So at 12:20, I'll be bowing out of here to go and attend that talk.
Fair enough. Mark was supposed to have left half an hour ago, so we're glad.
Yeah, I'm gonna have to go along. Anyway, hand up for two things. One is because I'd almost forgot, but because, well, actually there are two sort of +1 things really. The first is to Fred's point about using the Oculus. I think I'm going to test the same thing, but what I would say is, to make absolutely plain that if I hadn't have done it, so even the comparatively little I have done has massively changed my perception of what's there. So for instance, I'm now watching people are beginning to pick up on their little Noda tool to riff to the next point. But whilst it's a proprietary app, people are now starting to do some more interesting things, and they're beginning to sort of say, yeah, but no, I don't want to make rinky-dink box and line diagrams. What I actually want to do is I want to explore things in space. So that's actually quite interesting to sort of see, and I'm beginning to sort of see some interesting things coming out of that. Peter's point about the sort of fetishization of open source software, it's this terrible thing. You start off with a good intent to do one thing and you end up in a slightly bad place because of your good intent. And one of the things I've been reflecting on preparing for this talk, and the sense of, well, why bother to collect this data, is that it allows us to do things like the visualizations that even if I can't do, I can't remember, Adam said it was ridiculous. It took him something like, I don't know, 20 minutes or something to do the first cut, which blew my tiny mind at the time. But that's so enriching, because anyone can play with that. Once that thing's made, pretty much anyone who knows how to operate a computer will know how to do that. So you don't have to come from a particularly technical background. And suddenly a world of data is at your fingertips. And I think that meshes quite neatly with the point Peter was making. It's something I've sort of seen over, gosh, where were we, 18 years now of support, basically helping out the Tinderbox community. A lot of people are very firmly not in the sort of technical side of the world, but without them realizing are actually doing really quite interesting things, because they don't bother about looking under the hood. They don't need to. What they need are tools that enable them to do weird stuff that nobody makes an app for, or they don't know how to code for themselves. And going back to the point I made at the start of the call, which is, well, if you don't know what the shape of the problem is, how on earth do you build something as hard-edged as a particular app? Because the sort of prototyping that someone like yourself, Brand, or Fabian has the competence to do is a very small number of people in the game. So it's super, but it's just actually sitting atop a vast amount of knowledge that it takes a while to acquire. If nothing, even if you have the competence, it takes a while to acquire. So I really like this idea of doing things that basically act as a springboard to a larger number of people to do more things with the information that you have.
Yeah, I mean, that's metadata in a sense, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that what it's interesting comparing the concept of metadata to the concept of open source. And I absolutely agree. Like, I have never interacted with an application or a community more obtuse than the ones that insist that you can download the source and compile. It's the most hostile thing any sort of collection of people who are ostensibly collected. Like, I have never compiled a whole program and found that to be a satisfying. Like, I am a software developer, 20 plus years in the industry, and I still hate it. And it's never been a good experience. I download software libraries and integrate them into my stuff, but entire applications that people say it's open source is like, that means I'm not going to use it if it's like that. I mean, there are open source applications that work very well. WebKit is pretty good, and Blender is excellent these days.
Yeah.
And it's interesting to think about that. Like, if you go back to Kay's, Computer for Children of All Ages, what sort of modifiable was there, and the early web, Berners-Lee and folks like that were saying was that it was supposed to be editable in a way that didn't just mean for an elite cadre of people who devoted these decades of work that people like Fabian and Adam and I have to all of the sundry skills that are necessary in order to be able to conduct that. That's essential for us to do, is to think holistically, not just about like, is it open source and being able to check a box there, but like, what are the dimensions of the sort of interaction with this that exclude people, and how can we break those down? And yeah, so I think that the data piece is really interesting, and in that if you can provide things in a way that it doesn't immediately panic people, then you're onto a good start. You were talking about Rome versus kind of what Omar was playing with before. I was thinking about that formalism aspect, that sort of understandable, but I think foolhardy drive to formalize and put bounds around a problem that to some extent Rome doesn't require in the same way that people having to come up with some kind of Uber schema, but that, yeah, I like the looser things can be, the better, I think, for allowing people to make sense of what it is that the results will be.
It's all a matter of nuance. So it's a bit like, I mean, comparing a mind map with a sort of spatial hypertext that happens to have lines in it. Some people will see the same thing. Others will see a slight difference, because one is entirely fixed in its process, and the other is, well, it looks like it because it's sort of functionally doing the same thing, but it's not constrained to do that. It can do all sorts of other things. And I noted you sort of made a side remark there, Elise, and I don't think that's a bad thing at all. I mean, it's very necessary that there are people who have the deep skill to push the edges of what's possible. I think the area where we come up short is not so much that people aren't doing the exploration, it's that we don't put enough societal effort, that's in our communication, in our teaching and training, into the vacuum that opens up behind that leading edge, and probably the front edge of everyone else following on behind. That's where we seem to have the biggest disconnect.
Yeah, I'm acutely concerned by it. Maybe not his term, but Jesse Schell had a great talk. Jesse Schell of Schell Games is an Imagineer. He has a career, but he did a talk about the curiosity gap, and just people being people who have the curiosity and the wherewithal to be able to kind of explore these tools end up with just phenomenal power. But and he was excited by it. I think I can't remember whether he was excited or alarmed by the disconnect, or how much he was in both, because they're both true, But I absolutely agree. I think that as much as it's fun for me to have superpowers, it's concerning how much at the mercy of people like me that leaves the rest of the people who don't have the wherewithal to be able to kind of pile into these tech tools and techniques, and the way in which those kinds of knowledge are tacitly protected, and people don't fail to go out of their way, to kind of demystify, so that people say they can't program. That's fine. I mean, I don't want to really either, but what I'd love to do is script, and actually distinction. So being able to write JavaScript is basically most of the time all I want to do. I can do other stuff, but when people don't realize that so much is available through JavaScript, and being able to make a web page is, I think, deeply concerning for what it means, people's sort of ability to interface with this ideas. We decided that universal literacy was a must-have a while ago, and we've gotten pretty good at that. But taking it further, I think, is a necessity at this point, and we have far less of an idea of how to approach that.
I think that when you talk about universal literacy, that was really a good closing comment for you, because if we go back to the earlier part of this discussion, I think part of the problem is that we have been living in an analog world where things have inherent things. You don't need metadata for like a glass. You don't need metadata to say how much Coca-Cola is left. Not that I drink Coca-Cola very often, but I think virtual reality offers us a new opportunity where we have to accept that every single goddamn thing have to be defined. It'll either be defined badly or well, but it has to be defined. And that's a discussion I've had with some very intelligent people lately. And it takes a while for them to get it, just like it took a while for me to get it. And I guess you went through the same thing yourselves. So talking about universal literacy, we need illiteracy. I was born in 1968, so early Mac, I remember those days, and we all have early memories, and it's nice to remember back to some of the early machines, but they were so in their box. It was like beautiful Mont Blanc pens that just happened to be rectangles. That is not the future, and to think about that is really, really difficult. And that's why I think the work that we're trying to do in our dialogue, which goes all over the place, is important, just to help us understand that there is a problem. And if we are to develop illiteracy, we have to really try to face what that is. It's very new. It's more different. In fact, the little, writing this whole thing up again, I'm writing that going from 2D digital into VR digital will be as big a shift as going from analog to digital. Every person over 60 disagrees with me, obviously.
No.
Mr. Anderson, is your hand up fresh?
No, my hand is up. Yes, because
Okay.
I was thinking of sort of so many points that's being made about another sort of thing that really surprised me. You know, having made a set of data, the one thing that's been really hard is to get anyone to have a sort of meaningful conversation about that. People will tell you, oh, it should be in this format, or you should work on it with this tool. Well, which is fine, but that misses completely the point of how should the data be structured, because it's not just a bit of sort of a big screed of plain text. How you organize the bits, or which bits, for instance, you do some pre-analysis in, counts of things that you can conceptualize, but many people, the large number of people, wouldn't easily find for themselves. I think this sort of thing matters, but trying to get anyone to have a halfway intelligent sort of conversation about that seems remarkably difficult. I think because, again, there is a perception at the moment that, well, the computer does that. And depending, you're either someone who knows how to make the computer do that, or the computer does it, i.e. somebody else does it. And we seem to be happy with those two quite binary positions. And I think that's rather sad, because, as you rightly point out, actually, you in these new worlds, even if we ourselves never use them in the moment, this other metadata needs to be there. You need to know what the glass is. And so we actually need to have sensible, non-overly sort of baroque technical conversations about what these things are and mean, and how they can be interchangeable, because this goes back to the gap we've just described. Because if the only people who can use this data are right at the bleeding edge, we still haven't solved the problem. Yes, we've made some metadata. We've made data sets of stuff, but we haven't made data sets that most people can use.
Absolutely. But before I hand over to you, Peter, sorry, it's just to use the word baroque. Please open the picture that I just sent. Actually, Peter, are you okay waiting a minute?
Sure.
Okay, fantastic. So we should also have baroque discussions, right? And what I mean by that is, if you look at that picture, I'm going to look at it in Lightroom, right? So I would like you to please look at it 1:1 pixels on whatever display you have. Hopefully you have large displays. I don't. So what have we got in this picture? We have two men oiling furniture. This is in my garden.
Mm-hmm.
The two men are the two grandparents who are staying with us from Ukraine. In the background on the left, you will see my son sitting with a hat and Anton pushing him on that thing. The reason I am bringing it up right now is 47 megapixels is not just more, it is completely different. And I think if we discuss, not necessarily at length now, but if we discuss what that means, it'll also help us discuss what virtual reality means, because normally, growing up as a photographer, I would like to take a picture, good lighting, get a person's head, blurry background, bokeh, all of that stuff. With this, it is a completely different thing, because it no longer captures a subject, it captures a scene. And the difference between a scene and a subject is qualitatively different. I still don't know what that means, but one of the things is to view this on Instagram on a phone is criminal, right? Partly because a lot of the informational value is gone.
Well, so to that end, I think that's one of the things that I've been thinking about recently is that looking at the entire, looking at the scale picture of that is not the same as looking at that picture. And so that's one of the places where, this sort of cartographic view of that a zoom out is equivalent is incorrect. And looking at the details, like you said, that you mentioned, and Hockney style, having a half dozen of those, maybe that's actually the picture more so than thinking that the scale model of the picture is the picture itself. Sorry. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's interesting, because looking at you guys, you all look terrible in photographic terms, very low quality devices. Obviously, Peter, you look best, but it's static. There is in that wonderful book that you made us read, Brandel, please remind me of the name again. Paul, what's her, something? Paul. Sorry?
Annie Murphy Paul, Extended Mind.
Yeah, thank you. You know, she talks about how the human brain likes a certain kind of foliage because it has a certain level of complexity to it, right? So similarly with sounds, if sounds are too low sampled, a lot of people get a headache from listening to those sounds because the brain has to fill in the gaps. So when it comes to imagery as well, when we move about in the world, whether we want to stare at a sunset or whatever, we take in a huge amount of information that digitally is missing, sometimes purposefully, like in a cartoon. But when we are now entering these virtual spaces, I mean, what we can build now is obviously pathetically crude compared to what we can do in 10 years, no question. But the fact that it will be perceived in this way has a, I don't know, there's some kind of parallel, but let's just park that. Peter, sorry.
Okay, first off, on that photo, it actually reminded me of the scene in Blade Runner when Harrison Ford's character is sitting with his advanced computer system and he has the photograph of the scene, and it's like enhance grid A47 to 58, enhance again, and then he sees the reflection off of the eyeball, and then he enhances a little bit more, and there's so many megapixels packed into that image that he's actually able to flip the thing around and read the serial number off of the snake scale in the reflection off of the girl's eyeball.
I always thought we were going to get one of those one Christmas, but it never came.
Well, we're on track at least. The other thing that comes to mind from the earlier point about needing to define everything, and that's sort of the eternal battle in law. We have references in cases, and we rely on this crude citation mechanism, and you're never quite sure why a given case is being cited because we're not reaching in and annotating the ideas inside of the cases. We're just going up to the level of an opinion that might be, 47-page long opinion. There's a point on one page. Okay, we can cite in, get to the page, but the opinion itself doesn't have any structure to it. We have such rough and crude structuring in them, and we don't have a uniform ontology. So even though an opinion might have some named labeled sections in it, there's no consistency across judges and across attorneys. Same thing with the cases. There's no underlying ontology that everyone's using to keep things in sync and organized. That's why the early days of legal information retrieval got locked on relying upon very labor-intensive third-party citation services. So you'd have West coming in, and what they basically have is a bunch of young lawyers sitting, reading all of the cases and assigning key numbers. So they created their proprietary ontology of legal ideas, basically just like a big subject matter outline of all the areas of law. And then they go through that case and figure out which different areas of law were related, and they'd attach the subject numbers. And that was incredibly useful and valuable. But then when we hit the computer era, the courts started dumping the raw text of opinions online in formats people could get to. The legal publishers relied upon the fact that they had the canonical page numbers, and the accident of choice of typeface and page breaks became the factor that enabled those corporations to be able to maintain their competitive advantage and extract money from the system, because you weren't going by paragraph numbers, you were instead going by these arbitrary page breaks, and you had to be using the correct citation service followed by the judges of whatever court you were appearing before. So one court might say, okay, we're going to go with West such and such. And if you didn't find out where the page breaks were in that citation service, you wouldn't be able to properly cite something for someone else to be able to find it. So this crazy accident, just where the page things fall. And then use of the key numbers fell off, because who wants to go and pay someone to be manually applying the key numbers when we can do pretty good with raw text searches and Boolean retrieval queries, which worked pretty well. So that was the next era, was the early Lexis era of forget about paying West for the key numbers. We'll just come up with strings of text and hope that we're doing well. Now that information retrieval started to hit a wall when you got into analogous cases. If you were dealing with a horse sperm donation case and you were suing someone because there wasn't sufficient motility in the horse sperm that you paid for, and you searched on horse and sperm, you'd find those related cases. But what if there was a ruling related to bovine sperm motility and you didn't have bovine in your search queries? You might miss it doing your raw Boolean search. So then the next stage was looking at clusterings of search terms so that you could have the system automatically widen it so it would realize if you were talking about putting horses out to stud, it would be analogous to putting other kinds of animals out to stud, and the system would then generate a new query for you, adding the search terms that you left out based upon
Peter,
a dictionary related term.
going quite far down the rabbit hole on this issue, but I do get the gist of what you're talking about.
Yeah. Okay. And then coming back up now, leaving the actual retrieval at the individual case level, you also have the problem at the legislative level where you make reference to the legislative history that doesn't incorporate into the actual statutes directly. So one of the things you're doing when you're arguing before a judge, you'll wind up going and digging into the legislative history. So there was a lot of assumptions that don't get formally built into the statute. And I'll have, basically, here are all of our presumptions, but again, there's no structure so that you can say, yes, there was a predicate upon which this piece of legislation was built that no longer applies. Let's revisit the legislation automatically. Or this legislation is referencing that other legislation, something comes around disrupting it. Let's automatically revisit things and clean them up. So the process of developing law is sort of analogous in some ways to dealing with software development projects and library dependencies and those kinds of structures. So we can get some leverage there, but basically it's an area that hasn't been adequately visited, and there's potential. I think that's where Frode's project that he's going to be talking about fits right in. So that was just sort of my segue to provide context to that topic.
Yeah, we'll talk about that in a second. But when you talked about the snake skin in Blade Runner, we are already taking 360 3D pictures in a sense, because with the new Apple stuff, you can tap on a subject and drag the subject out of the picture somewhere else. That's just the beginning of computational photography. And mobile phones will have many more pixels soon. So if you have a record of the pictures you've taken before of the same subject or similar subject, it isn't that far away that we can look at what's on the side. So it's just what is being made possible now is just absolutely obscene. When it comes to law stuff,
we live in exciting times.
Yeah, that ancient Chinese curse, right? So when the project, I'm going to stay on the record for this for a little bit, but Brendel, I don't think you have been told anything about this. But a friend of mine is way back when I was doing my master's. She is doing a tender for a project to work with the British government to build an API for business regulation. So we have digital business regulations even in this country, and it is accessible through web forms and all of that stuff. It's quite good. So then now some government person has said it needs to be human and machine readable. And the kind of gummy effect is that at one point it looks really simple, just an API. So it's almost just a technical thing. And then it keeps being stretched into adding different levels of value on top. Including all kinds of stuff. And one thing that I've been discussing with them is we probably need more firm user stories. And, if someone's already a web scraper doing the kind of stuff Peter just talked about for money, fine, keep doing it, right? It's okay that this service will make it easier for them. It's fine to have what they call the RegTech, regulation technology industry, nothing wrong with that. But it would be interesting to find out if there was also a small, medium-sized enterprise manager who needs to find out where to put the light sockets in the building. a few very specific things. And that's probably relatively straightforward. But then the question becomes also, as Peter was highlighting, how easily can you see if this has been superseded? How can you see if it's related to other cases and so on? Business regulation is, of course, not the same as general law, because government says this is so and this is so. Of course, it can be contested based on other things, but
it begs a question as to how much law, and this is going to sound a bit waspish, but it's not read that way, but how much law is designed to be used without resort to humans. So I'm not trying to be unkind to lawyers.
Yeah,
the point is,
right,
in other words, you have to have
right.
people interpret it. We haven't really made much effort to say, no, here's the thing, you can look it up in an app and you will get an answer, and you'll get an answer that's necessary and sufficient.
I think that's a really completely important thing. And this is why, if I'm going to be involved in discussing this with them, and if we're going to have a forum of us type brains that are all very different, it is really, really clear that a lawyer brain is different, which is why we're interested in you, Peter. There are different ways.
The lawyer programmer brain is really different, because we deviate from straight lawyer brains and straight programmer brains.
Yeah, exactly. And I have a friend who, Phil Gooch, who does Scholarcy, he does a lot of work with APIs. So just knowing what an API actually is very different from theoretically what an API is. But it becomes a very, very interesting question on so many levels, which is why I've been spreading out. But nobody, except for Mark and Peter, really are happy touching this, because it is a commercial thing. So what we may try to do is, outside of this, have an open forum that's released immediately for anybody to use to discuss the issues. Carl Malamud, I'm not sure how to pronounce his name. He did the first internet radio. He's doing a lot of work with open government access and so on. Vint introduced me to him, but he said no for that specific reason. But we're having separate dialogue. But it's kind of crazy that something this important goes through this kind of a tendering process like that. It really should be some kind of a university deep and wide look first, shouldn't it?
But my point earlier wasn't entirely, it wasn't just that way. The thing being that, it's us being sort of actually level-headed about the degree to which we can take our idealized hard-edged structure and take something that was never intended to be fitted in that sort of a rig. And so, in other words, one of the questions that we genuinely should ask of the people who want this done is, do you realize what you're actually asking for? Because if you just try and take everything, fit it in a hard-edged frame, as sure as night follows day, bad things will happen. The more elegant thing to do will be to start in the areas that are tractable to the use of these things. And the good thing about that is that would then inform, the experience will then inform us into ways that we can sort of lay that back across the things that are a less good fit, which might either lead to saying, to an extent, we're saying we are never going to automate these parts to the level we are in this area, because it is just not a good thing to do at the moment. But I can't, yes, next new episode of something.
New episode.
For all mankind.
I haven't seen it yet. Looks good.
Best thing on TV. Okay, please continue, Mark. I just got interrupted.
It's just that. So that the thing is, lest it sounds as though I'm being glass half empty. It's not at all that. It's saying, look, start with the things that it makes sense to start with, and to be mindful that the people, i.e. the government, who are asking for this, will not be the people best able to articulate and understand that. Their starting point will be they have a problem, they want it solved, and they want it solved by yesterday, and preferably by signing a large check and then not having to do any more work.
The check is not that large, but I get
no, but I mean that's how it works. They don't want to really.
That's what government.
They want someone to take it away and give them back a nice shiny answer, and that's not good.
It's not going to be a shiny answer. There's going to be processes that will have to be looked at, including what we're talking about. But one of the really key things, of course, is that ignorance of the law is not a defense. So, to basically, to try to get the basics out there. For instance, this example of the power plugs, when we did the renovation here, the power plugs are really high off the floor. And all the electricians told me that is the law, that's regulation. And I said, that's a bit weird. You know why? They said flooding. We're on a
Yeah.
hill. There will be no flooding here.
I was going to say, on a slope like yours, flooding is a serious danger.
Yeah, and then I went to Norway. A friend of ours has an electrical company there, and I saw the plugs were really low. And I asked him, and he said, "Oh, many, many, many decades ago." Right, but this is such a good case because when I did the Googling of this way back then, just to see, because I thought it was so weird, I couldn't find it. So and to have a case study of a very specific question, it should be findable by an end user. And it's really, really hard, Mark. So I think I'm agreeing with everything you said.
Yeah, yeah.
It's just that it has to be looked at in an open way. It shouldn't just be a couple of consultancies trying to get the business doing what they can and then, stretching it out. Peter, I'm sure you have perspectives on this.
Okay, I just dropped a link in the sidebar to a research website Brad Myers developed back in 2009 on API usability. So we should probably flip through that stuff before we take the meeting with your friend.
All right, thank you. Yeah. I mean, the whole API issue is, of course, partly what should be in it, what should be captured and how should it be, these are serious hypertextual issues, of course.
Also on a really deep issue, I think at some point, maybe we should revisit the ignorance of the law is no defense. I think if the law is designed to prevent the ordinary person who's being subjected to it from being able to understand what is expected of him, then I think just at a moral level, it's wrong to punish him. If you can't articulate clearly enough so that an average person can understand what his legal obligations are, then the problem is with the law, not the person who didn't adequately follow the law.
It's not just a problem with the law,
absolutely.
it's a problem of the culture as well. I mean, not to be disrespectful, but, right now you're having the January 6th hearings in America. And, if that many people think it may actually have been okay what happened, then there's a problem with the educational system as well. So that's part of the issue with meeting recordings and recording process. We want end results out. We may not always want what goes into the sausage to be made public, Sorry, those are different issues, but there you go.
Yeah, well, I mean, in that ignorance context, it's not necessarily law, but it's supposed to be legally binding. It's end user license agreements, and a lot of people believe that the sort of legal status of end user license agreements in their current form is pretty dicey. And I think that's right because there's so little to go on. They're not meant to be read. There's no real sense in which any of that information is actually supposed to go in. It's just the absolute most minimal fig leaf of plausible deniability of what's going on there.
And there's no meaningful opportunity to negotiate.
Right. No,
you just bought a piece of hardware and now you can turn it back to the store, or you accept these 20,000 pages of gobbledygook.
Yeah, and so if you dispute a small part of it, then there's no way to be able to negotiate about what kind of functionality is appropriate, things like that. I think Doc Searle's sort of point on vendor rights management, I haven't checked in on where that is recently, but I think that's an interesting one. Something that, as you were talking about user stories, struck me. When I was lying in bed last night getting to sleep, I was thinking about the fact that the word application and the word employment are essentially synonyms. That an application in the sense of being applied, in the sense of it being employed to do something, they are the same thing. And so is user story, frankly. Like, it's all about making something be for doing something. And it's essential to be keyed into the real application domain in the sense of where this information is supposed to be applied. It's something that, as Mark kind of intimated, is challenging in a governmental context where you have deep experts sort of reasoning about these things and failing to understand just how familiar people aren't with those particular sort of pieces. One thing, as I've kind of said before, I'm not a great reader, and so to that end, one of the things, if nothing else, just putting more white space between stuff would be a really great start for all of your sort of regulation and sort of visualization.
It's interesting actually, maybe just by chance, when you were mentioning user stories as an application things. In a way, maybe that's part of the problem, is that unintentionally what people actually end up doing with user, they sort of use them as the tick list. So instead of using as a means to understand the problem space, what they actually use them for is the completion tick list, which is where all sorts of things go wrong, because basically you overfit for the exam questions.
Yeah, that's a fair warning, actually. One of the things I've talked to this team about is when looking at this, when we better understand it, we should be looking at it from 10, 15 years in the future, where VR is the main access for information. And that means that the metadata relevance for different pieces and how they connect could be very, very different, because it's no longer just a virtual sheet of paper clicked to another one. And I can see Brenda on that.
Yeah, so I just sorry to jump in, but I wanted to mention the YouTube link that I cited there is it's Ed Catmull. I don't know if you've ever read Creativity Incorporated, but he was a co-founder of Pixar, and he's responsible in computer graphics for things like the Catmull-Clark and Catmull-Blom curves. These are foundational, absolutely bare bones, like what graphics is made out of. And one of the things that he talked about, it's actually called the Open Metaverse podcast. A friend of mine, Patrick Cozy, and another guy from NVIDIA, chatting to people that they think are relevant for that. And they got Catmull to talk. And who's, if you don't know, is an absolute titan of what graphics is and how it all store computers. And one of the things, so he did, he went to University of Utah under Sutherland in 1970. And so whether he was at the demo or not, I don't know, he doesn't say there. But he says that what they were doing there was recognizing that a lot of the investigative techniques that they were making were irrelevant under the absolute definite contemporary right now context, but with the expectation that Moore's law was running its course. Nobody really knew how long it was going to go, but it was going. And so the question is, what will the relevant techniques once these parameters change by 1 or 2 orders of magnitude? Once these things become 10 or 100 times better, faster, smaller, whatever, what are the things that we can imagine will be relevant in the future? And I think it's a phenomenal lesson in what to do to plan for the future. And at one point, I've made this point here in the past, but it's worth making again, is that at a certain point, Moore's law ceased to be a law of nature and became a law of economics. It's that if you could pour all of the money in the world into these things, what is the absolute fastest people can accelerate these things and these pieces of silicon to be able to do stuff. And it was in large part because there were these people on the forefront imagining what those applications would be at such point as those things existed. And he said that the point of the early 90s, where Pixar had been publishing absolutely everything that they thought of, and so game developers and other people built all of the bits and pieces that they had, and then silicon developers said, "Oh my God, I can sell so much stuff if I just keep building all of these things in this way." And Catmull says that he believes that virtuous cycle being supercharged at that point by various things is what gave rise to machine learning and all of the developments in silicon that happened from the early 90s to the late 90s, which it was the place where I was most keyed into the hardware sort of discussions. So a special place for me, but it strikes me as having been exceptionally special in terms of the sea change of what it was people thought computers could do, the advent and development of GPUs, and this runaway sort of sense of like, well, now we have these monstrous GPUs. What do we do with them? So yeah, amazing for that particular question of like, what do we do about 2 orders of magnitude, which I think is essential thinking for anybody who comes within 10 feet of a computer.
And now, of course, we're going to have a bigger imagination problem with virtual reality. When we have control every single thing. Mark?
A lot of responsibility.
Well, I put something again in a slightly not light-hearted note, but I reflect on it. I think it's more serious. What's API? Well, it's AI with a P stuck in the middle to the general populace. And that's really worrying because AI is magic, as we know. Magic, you're not allowed to ask what it is. It's magic and it works, and you're supposed to shut up and accept it. And that's dangerous when you get to things like the law, because most things, you look at most professions, there's a thing outside that says you've got to be this tall to get on the ride, and no exceptions, no free passes. So what this is problematic with something like an API, because you sort of have to ask the question, well, are you bright enough to ask a question of the Oracle? Because with much power comes much responsibility, and in essence, being able to talk to the API has that. It's not about whether you sort of charge people, that kind of gatekeeping. It's incumbent on the person structuring it. It's not just saying, here is my sort of database, and I'm going to put this layer of software around it that means that anyone can get whatever they need out of it. That solves no problems, well, a few very small problems, but actually having a layer around that it makes people to understand, oh, well, if you want to sort of solve this, if you want to solve this sort of problem, or ask this sort of question, what you actually need to be asking for is this sort of thing, which I would venture to suggest for an awful lot of people would be something that wouldn't be their first thought. Right.
Yeah, just briefly on that. First of all, what I've seen from the government on this level is they wanted all kinds of machine learning on top of this to enrich it. And they quickly learned that would be very expensive. There would be problems, and they agreed that raw stuff should be made available. So that's a maturity that was nice to see. But on the other side, we have these Ukrainians living here. Only 2 of them speak English. And I just take up my iPhone and say, translate to Russian, blah, blah, blah. And the amazing thing at machine learning at this point is my voice, when it transcribes it, is always flawless. It's been months now. Not a single mistake. It's absolutely incredible. When the internet connection is good enough in Wimbledon, it's not always. It's a little tricky to do the other way around. Basically, everyone has to have their own device. But that is one of those things that was kind of viewed as sci-fi a while ago, and now it's just a utility. It's just absolutely incredible. So even though your important stuff, I agree with. I just got a message that coffee was delivered. I didn't see anyone. It is really, really important that the black box of what happens in there, when it, especially important things, is seeable. There is a lot of stuff we can get out of there. It's just crazy.
Just a quick qualification, because Peter has his hand up. But what I think what I'm alluding to is you're absolutely right. Part of the problem is that the magic that you've just described with what Siri's doing, for instance, in your translation at the moment, can mislead us, because not all parts of things that you might ask that ecosystem of it. You talked about something less mainstream, it would be less good, and that is in no way, shape, or form a discredit to the people who built these systems. It's just they feed on the data, so the problem is you will have people sat across the table from you whose view of what they're asking for is exactly the magic you've described, and yes, at some point that will be true, but I don't think it's necessarily true today. And that can be incredibly, this is something I found when I was working up in government, trying to get, I was talking to them about this, they wanted to do AI trawling of emails, and they just didn't have a clue at how complex the problem was. And you couldn't convince them otherwise, because my daughter does this, and you're thinking, well, I just give up and go home. I mean, it's, you're never going, and that's not to be unkindly to bright people. It's just they couldn't. Well, they weren't being given enough information to understand how limited their worldview was of these quite problematic areas. Sorry, Peter.
Okay, I was wondering whether anyone's used any ontology editors like Protege, and then I'm going to have to bow out because that Milan talk on design after capitalism is about to start.
I don't like ontologies.
Okay, on that note, I'll see you all on Monday.
I mean, I do.
Peter. Have a good weekend.
I do believe the House of Parliaments guys were doing, they were doing something structured in terms of they were trying to produce an ontology for international treaties, which sounded quite funky. But I have the same slight worry bead of, it's a bit like mainstream management consultancy. So where someone takes a very expensive template, rams it over your reality, shaves off all the nasty curly bits around the edge, and hands you a big bill and nothing useful. And this is the problem that I keep finding myself trying to help people avoid. It's very seductive, mainly because people offer things they can't possibly deliver, and this is part of the snake oil around AI. I mean, there is some absolutely really wonderful stuff being done, probably more in the image space than in the text space, but nonetheless, but it doesn't just translate across the piece. If only because the amount of necessary learning and the training materials often don't yet exist.
Well, have a good weekend. I'm switching Zoom streams now. Bye-bye.
Bye, Peter. Yeah, I think maybe we finish a bit earlier today because Mark, you're stressed. But did you want to go through the presentation now? I don't know if Brandel, you want to.
I can flick. Brandel might be amused to see the slides. He's not going to go to the. He's not going. I shall quickly. I'll give you a quick sort of recitative of what you saw at the beginning. Yeah. And there's nothing that can't be. I mean, this is going to be public in a week. So I mean, the number of people who watch this between now and then anyway is minor. So let me just find the share screen. Share screen. Where is, oops, that wants to go there, that wants to go there. So Brandon, you'll probably recognize Dave Lard. He's my supervisor or ex-supervisor. So essentially this is a talk, so I'll start with this. Get on the right page. Just to explain where it came from.
I believe.
Yep. Can you see it?
That you would want to share your screen.
I do. Sorry. Am I sharing?
It doesn't look like it to me.
No. Okay. Right. Let's start again. Stop. Right. Okay. I think I know what I've done. Let me see. That's better, I think.
There you go. Yep.
Sorry about that. I selected the right screen. I failed to press the button to share it. Right. Sorry about that. Okay. So the start is just to say where the data came from. And one of the interesting things was I took it upon myself to add something that arguably isn't formally part of the conference. Because in the early days, there was a European conference on hypertext technology. It has a couple of interesting papers in. And whereas the two that followed it, in 92 and 94 were effectively post hoc adopted by ACM. The first one was with a net result actually that you can't find. I haven't got it, but you can't find the it's out of print, and in fact you actually have to go and dig quite hard in the Cambridge Union Cambridge Academic Press website to actually find that thing. So then what I'm going to do is I take three, rather than go through all the fluff in the paper. I mean, the paper is basically a whole lot of facts of the normal sort, but a couple of things we've done unusually is, one is, having worked out all the unique authors, I took all the long and short papers and effectively tried to look at author persistence. So the green is people publishing for the first time, unique authors. The blue is people who've published at least twice.
Did you say green? You mean yellow?
Blue in the middle band.
No, I see blue, yellow, and green.
Yeah, gray.
Excuse me, I see blue, yellow, and gray. That's what. But you said green, did you?
No, I don't think I did. Sorry, there's an auto advance on this. Sorry. So so basically, what this one is trying to show is at the bottom layer of the graph is people who are publishing for the first time. Now, they may be a first-time publisher and have co-authors who published before. So in this, each unique author is an independent actor within the set.
Hang on, for the yellow, new continuing. What do you mean by continuing?
So if they are,
sorry, I've done it the wrong. I've labeled it the wrong way up. So these are people. The yellow are people who are publishing for the first time. But they become blue the next year.
Okay, I think.
Sorry, I misstated it. Yeah. So yellow is the number of people in any given year who are completely new to the corpus, but also that they are people who become part of the blue band in a subsequent year.
I think you should.
The grey
probably-
people.
I think you
Yeah.
can label that clearer. Brenda, what do you think?
I haven't got time to go and rebuild all the pictures, but yeah, I'll cover it in the talk. But
Okay, fine.
it's difficult. I've been around this. It's infernally difficult to do. Dave and I went through this at some distance. Most people will find a way to misunderstand the basic thing. What you're trying to do is saying, how long do people stay with the conference in terms of publishing?
The graphic
they're
is
also-
great.
Sorry?
Really good graphic. It communicates really well. It was just that labeling.
Yeah. So basically, the grey are people who turn up once and are never seen again, and the blue transition into the yellow transition to blue. Now, if someone who's in the grey set 10 years later publishes a paper, then they would go into the blue set. So it's only a glimpse, and the interesting thing here, given the conversation we've just been having, is you can't be all hard-edged. All you can say is this indicates, whereas most people want to say, but what is the exact thing? What is the exact average length of an author? You think, well, who knows? All we know is, in this sense, we know when they first publish and when they last publish. Those are the only things that we really know. And very few papers are single author these days. So the authors are coming and going independent to one another. So, but it's interesting. I've not seen this done before for a conference. I've seen it done in some other contexts. So Dave is to thank for prodding me to do that. That was an awful lot of work. This is another thing you don't see people do very often, because go to any technical conference and a room full of normally men will sit around and say, oh, there aren't enough women here. And then carry on. And I thought, well, okay, well, let's put some figures to this. And one of the problems was I had to go through 2,500 discrete individuals and attempt to apply a gender. And that's really hard now. Luckily, this data sort of precedes the time where we were thinking about non-binary genders and things. And you can't just get all huffy and say it doesn't matter, because it does to the individuals concerned. But in this case, there's only it's on a different graph. There's one person who I know who identifies as non-binary, and we have at least 2 or 3 people who are trans, and that's fine. But what we were trying to do here is just say that, in essence, are non-men getting a fair crack of the whip? It's one way to think of it, which is what this is attempting to answer. And what you're seeing here is, in this conference, we're getting between 20 and 40% of authors in any given across all papers, authors participating are women, and the orange bars are where it's a woman who's the first author, which I think is an equally important thing to look at, because the name of the first author lives on in a way that the second or 400th author does not. There's a really interesting aspect that you suddenly raise in looking at this is, in this case, I'm looking at the full and short papers. So that's the sort of 10, 12 page versus the 6-page papers. So not posters, not panels, not keynotes. But in some senses, you actually need to put them in. And this is why, to me, these static graphs are far less used than the data set that they sit on the top of. Because these are the questions people should be mature enough to be asking. Say, okay, this is what this graph shows us. If I say expand the scope to all items published versus just the full and short papers, how does it change? One of the things we'd see is a bit more representation by women, because, for instance, people have made more attempt to have women as keynote speakers and in panels and things. Anyway, so that's that one. This one's an interesting thing. I discovered that something like 80%, maybe a bit less, something like 70% of all keywords, author keywords in 30 years of the conference are nonce terms. They're used only once. In this graph, what I've done is I've done a minimal amount of aggregation of terms. So I've taken hypertext and hypermedia as one thing, and I've taken something like social network and social networks and different casing of the same words as one. But what I haven't done is, for instance, taken every keyword that starts with hypertext and has another word after it as being hypertext, because it's actually being more precise. What this attempts to show you is the themes over the life of the conference. So you do see the World Wide Web, which is the orange group from sort of 96 to about 2005, and it goes down because basically the World Wide Web disappeared to be its own conference. And in the middle, about 2006, you see hypertext near-death experience, at which point they decided they'd do social networks as well. So unsurprisingly, you see Twitter, which is the brown thing, coming in at about 2012. But
Now,
actually,
this is really super nice. And I'm wondering, Brandel, if you're thinking of different ways to represent this, like with your magic carpet and so on. Now that Mark
sure, yeah,
the data available.
Yeah, the absolute numbers here are very interesting and valuable. It's also just as useful to be able to see the kind of relative flow. So each of these bars being normalized. I mean, yeah, it's all fascinating stuff. I was also thinking in the context of gender, like whether ACM hypertext actually does any encoding of rejected papers, or knowing how many times somebody's had a paper rejected before they get it accepted, and also the main number of authors per year against the female authors, because of the proportion of genderness and stuff. It's really interesting. But yeah, absolutely, this is great.
Because thing is, one of the things I'm not released in the public data set is actually the gender assignment, because it was done by me and me only, with assistance from some people, and I don't feel that's sufficiently rigorous enough to put in a publicly accessible. So I am making an assessment about something that's deeply personal to lots of people. I don't think that's academically rigorous enough to just put out there as a public thing. But one of the things I will be saying in the talk is, if anyone with academic bona fide or research bona fides wants to come and ask me about it, I'd be very happy to share it. But what I'm not prepared to do is just to put all the raw data out there, lest it be misused. Which I think is you can tell me if it is or isn't, but I think that's a mature way to deal with this. Whereas all the author, in fact, I haven't put in the current public data set, I haven't put all the discrete authors. That was a lot of work, just deduplicating all the authors, because you would assume that the publishers do that, but they do up to a point. And then, so if it's wrong in DLACM, it'll be wrong in DBLP, it'll be wrong in Google, it'll be wrong in Web of Science, it'll be wrong in Scopus, because garbage in, garbage out, if the publisher doesn't get it right, nobody else is going to bother. So keywords, the interesting thing is, so under 1% of discrete keywords tell us anything meaningful. What Dave and I riffed on is when looking at this is that why, it's fine, let authors put their keywords in, but why do we use them? What we ought to have is we should have a post hoc keywording system, because a point Dave made, which I thought was quite right, is if you're in an emergent field, so look at social networks in the last decade, how would you know in 2011 that Twitter was something as important as it is now, or as visible as it is now? You just wouldn't. So that's another thing that I think arises from this. So when I look at this, I find it interesting, but I'm also glad Brandel sort of noted the same XKCD of, woo, let's count things. Let's count the countable things and make pretty pictures. I do wonder, for all of this, how much it tells us. So the provocation for starting all this was in 2013.
Sorry.
Yep.
I just had a great idea about your keywords question. And that is, given that you don't know what a paper is until you show people what it is, an interesting method of investigation then would be to look at the keywords of the papers that cite the paper. So you do the one-hop keyword check, and you would potentially have the ability to look at the manner in which that body of knowledge is actually being received. It's oblique because the paper is not the other paper, but it gives you a better sense, because right now citations are citations. Unfortunately, citations aren't qualified, but it would be a really interesting investigation. Sorry.
I think you're absolutely right. And one of the things is I want to encourage people to go away and do this. It took me a boatload of time to extract this data, partly because it's not there in any tractable form in DLACM, and partly because my real bugbear, I don't think many people actually bother to look at the raw data. So not only is this being extracted, but with difficulty, which wouldn't have been a problem had there been a proper API, but that's a whole different thing. But it's also been looked at, and a fair amount of sort of correction and tidiness and stuff has gone into it, which definitely wouldn't happen if you were just slurping it out of a large database.
So, Mark,
Yep.
a couple of things. Number one,
Yep.
Randall's comment is obviously genius, and you have made it possible for that kind of thinking to happen. For you to do it would be significantly more work, but it is possible to have it done now. The discussion that I want us to have soon on libraries or how documents relate, I think this is really perfect as a part of the situation, because when I looked earlier today, for instance, do I want to organize my author documents or my reader documents? The reader documents are more important because they have been made. The author ones may have not been finished made, and it's a bit of a mess, right? So
Yeah.
no, go back, because that was
No, sorry, it's
okay.
I've left as a timer. I can't.
Oh, okay. Yeah,
Don't worry.
So this kind of stuff that can get really messy. I mean, this is
Yeah.
pretty obvious. It's complete mess, except for the person doing it, which is why the interactivity is so crucially important, obviously. But
Yeah,
to be
you
able
make
to,
an
but
yeah,
just
and you make another really interesting point too, in your point about the author docs and the reader docs. And this is something, again, I think people consistently lowball, either because they know how and can't be bothered, or they don't know how. Now, they're different groups of people, but it arrives at the same point that in order for these things to be easily done, you need to think quite carefully about how the data is in some way stored. And this was what I was alluding to earlier when we were speaking about, well, you know, at the moment I've created some data tables and things. For me it's very flexible because I've got it in a Tinderbox document, but I'm beginning to push the size of where it happily lives in a, you know, what was a desktop tool designing for sort of, you know, a bit of notation and light blogging. It's a wonderful toolbox for incremental formalization. But, you know, for instance, if someone said, okay, could you do this for Kai? The answer will be, well, no, I couldn't. Not without, you know, a couple of software engineers and people who could sort of take the ideas, build them out. So that your point is absolutely right. You need the ability to actually be able to service the request. So when you said, yes, I want this data set, but I this time I want it, you know, I only want it for these documents.
yeah,
And that the person who's making the data available has thought through the structuring of the data in such a way that you can put that line through, because very often you can't, because they never thought about that.
Yeah, absolutely. So here's the thing. This thing about basically what Brandel said is it becomes social tagging, but not just leaning back in a chair and using a finger to click tag on documents.
Mm-hmm.
The fact that you make a new work is a really intellectually thought through social tagging. So it is really worthwhile. But what I'm also thinking about in relation to the discussion earlier about what I hope we can talk about soon is how about we consider really looking at this in terms of Mr. Anderson starting data sets being gold. And then, you know, with Visual Meta, of course, any document should be able to slot into this easily. But if we look at creating an incredible reading experience, we can present that to ACM, the publishing people who we now have a good relationship with, and saying, if they accept papers in this and this form, we can make this and this reading experience available.
Yeah, and the difficult point in raising this too is the fact that most people tend to get in a huff. They find something to be insulted about, and my perspective is not. None of this, although it's critique, is ad hominem in the sense that most of the problems arising here from mispresumption or misassumption or just, you know, good old fashioned ignorance. If you don't know what you don't know. Just quickly to flick through. So I'd alluded to, so, you know, but this is really why I did this part of the talk, because I thought for 4 years people essentially were saying to me, why bother? And I thought, what am I missing? So that the three intersecting things that occur. So one is people saying, why you bother? It's been done before, and actually it hasn't. Because the one that really made me sit up was someone who's quite sort of pointedly said, it's all in DBLP. So I went and looked for some things that I knew were wrong, and sure enough, they're wrong. And they're wrong in Google Scholar, and they're wrong in Scopus, and they're wrong in Web of Science. Because what that person didn't understand was all the information derived from the primary source. And if the primary source was wrong, there's not much you can do. Then the next sort of leg of the stool is, why aren't you just hoovering in with an API? As it happens, DLACM doesn't have one. It specifically excludes web scraping in its terms of use, and actually monitors for people doing that and kicks them off its site. It'd be a nightmare to do anyway, because even the rebuild of DLACM has woefully poor semantic structure in its HTML. It's got lots of stuff for marketing and styling and stuff, but nothing semantic that tells you about the data when you look at the HTML structure. And it does all these silly games where it'll have features where if one thing in a list is missing, if there's a list of 4 things, in some cases you get 3 things rather than 4 things, one of which is empty, which is really what you would ideally want to happen. And then I've made the point about, API also, you just get garbage in much more quickly if you don't think about what you're doing. Also, there should be a feedback loop for people with established bona fides to point out errors and have them properly, the provenance of that tracked, but fix is done, or else the rubbish just goes round and round. And then this thing about code, and this actually is rather pertinent to what we were discussing in terms of the legal stuff, is, if you don't know what you're building, you don't know what tools to design. What happens a lot in this sort of area is people, they'll start with something, they'll start with a conceptual but very hard edge structure like an ontology, and they'll use that as the excuse to build very hard edge tools about a problem space that they still haven't properly thought through and defined. And it goes to my closing point of, will no one think of the data? Because that's where you should start from. If you don't understand that, you really shouldn't be on the ride, or you shouldn't be in a sort of managerial part of the ride. The next bit you guys have seen, and I'm just going to show them. I'm actually, annoyingly, this is the only plugin I can find that let me run a web page inside PowerPoint. Will not let me. It will not honor CSS, but I think this was built by Microsoft in about 1999, so it's amazing. It's probably only really works in Microsoft Internet Explorer 5.5, would be my guess. So the last part, and Fred will see some recognized points here, is, you have all this conference, is all that remains a PDF? And I still think the tail is wagging the dog. I still think basically all people are thinking about is what you could afford to put in a printed book. And it was very interesting when I asked Dave, I said, well, so what brief do conference organizers get? Because these conferences are organized by members of the academic community who volunteer for this. And yes, there's kudos that comes from doing it over time, but essentially you do it for free. They get next to no guidance. So the main thing they worry about is, are enough people turning up so we won't go bust? Are papers of enough quality turning up? The idea that they might keep any other data at all, I suspect, wouldn't necessarily occur, and I definitely don't think anyone's telling them. So what we end up is just something that feeds the more of the citation and bibliometric analysis combine, which is really sad. And separately, as we all know here, PDFs are not a great way to, this is where you send your text to go and die. Because in the age of AI and ML, that's the last thing you want. You want clean text. It's no good if you've got a document using things like ligatures that have no clean text character.
There's nothing wrong with PDF inherently.
No, but it's not. It comes with a lot of significant downsides in the current age that people just haven't thought through. The point is, it's not that PDF
Mark,
is bad. It's not that they're not thinking to the future.
You need to be careful with this. This is one of the issues that came up in my Viva thing. And that is, if you use the modern extensions and specs of PDF, you can put all kinds of goodies in there.
You can, but at the moment, no one's using them. So
yes,
I'm mindful of that argument.
Mark, that's also my argument. So just be careful how you present it so you don't waste time with, you know,
No,
going.
no, I will, and I'm going to have to go through that, you know, because I've only got 10 minutes to do this whole thing, which is really annoying because you normally get 20 minutes for a long
Well,
paper.
So then a question for you, is there a
Yeah.
physical book at the end of these conferences anymore?
No, and that's why I think it's a cruel irony that we're still designing for a book that we don't produce.
Yeah.
So in other words, my provocation
Brutal.
is, why are we limiting ourselves in with the data that we hold? I mean, yes, there's some tangential cost to keeping some extra metadata. And I'm not saying it has to be DLACM's task, but what I'm really saying to the conference is, which comes onto this, you know, hypertext actually is quite an influential conference in a number of ways. It's an important progenitor of the web. But the web is not hypertext. It's only a form of hypertext. And it's very important that at least some people in the world understand that. And hypertext is also an interesting cross bridge between computer science and humanities. You know, between sort of more literary world and an empirical world. And so it, you know, knowing what's going on here and seeing some of the ideas, because I'm a contrarian when it comes to citations. Citation counts. The last thing I'm impressed by is by a high citation count. If something's important, you'll generally hear about it. If something's massively cited, you often look at it and think, God, this is a load of garbage. There's something interesting in this.
Well, you know, there have been studies showing that with the citation systems now, canonical sources are cited more and unique sources.
No, absolutely. So first mover advantage is massive. Yeah.
But just in terms of feedback, before we get to your closing thoughts,
Yeah.
the way that I see your presentation is very, very simple. Look what can be done, where you're showing those amazing graphs. I think all of them should be bunched together, including the atom burn and all of that stuff.
Yeah.
And then you have a completely separate section saying, this should be automatic. It isn't. Let me tell you why.
Yeah.
I think you can make it that simple, because then you can choose what level of detail to go into. Because now you seem to go a little bit back and forth because you're so passionate about it.
Yeah. I mean, the point I want to get to at the end is saying, look, you can go read the paper, and what I wouldn't be so unkind to do is to compare and contrast the paper Dave and I wrote with a similar one, which was done for the World Wide Web Conference, which is on larger data set, and is, you know, it really is a case of the XKCD. Is we counted up the countable things, and you read it and you learn nothing from it, because what it shows is the countable things aren't very interesting. And because they've only taken the headline things, they can't really draw any inferences from the data they present, which it was really interesting because it only came out a month ago, and to me was a vindication of everything I've been doing silently in the weeds. But anyway, that's the gist of it.
I'm not trying to stress you, Mark, but in addition to the simplicity of showing the really great graphs, and then you're saying, no, you can't just do this now. I think you should have a third section at the end saying, my recommendation for going forward is, you know, what should be, or maybe it's not even strong recommendation, but something like the community might want to consider different data formats or this kind of metadata, just like a
it's sort of, it's there. The funny thing is I've been, you wouldn't think I've been actually working on this now for about 3 weeks.
No, but
and it's getting and I have till midnight Hawaii time now.
No, but Mark,
Mark,
Mark, hang on. It's amazing work, and I can see you worked it over and over and over. That's why the slides are going like this. It happens to me too. That's why I'm trying to be, I'm pretending to be like a teacher person saying, look at this amazing stuff. No, you can't do it now. I suggest this for the future.
So the closing thought, the reason I haven't called it conclusions is not the conclusions of the paper. And I'm doing this because Dave very nobly said, no, he said, no, I think it's a great idea. It's been done before. And one of two things happens is either nobody talks about it ever again, such talks, or everybody talks about it. So he said, it's about time we had another one. And he said, you're probably pent up enough that you may just get something that'll get people talking.
Yeah, but Mark, people will, if they talk about it, the way that it's structured now, and which is not including everything in your brain, it'll be, the data is a bit sucky, isn't it? Let's have a coffee, right? If the specific things that you have that other people haven't, that is, in order to deal with this in the future, blah, 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 that is discussable over coffee.
Yeah, I think what I need to do is to put most of the last slide, the closing thoughts, into the bit about the PD. I can live without that. I'm probably trying to overload the process. It's in the paper anyway. And to abstract on the last page and just say the sort of things, look, can't we try better? The possible things we can do is at least give, better guidance to conference managers, decide what we can keep and what we want to keep and what we're allowed to keep. So for instance, there are things like, things like gender, that you hit issues over what you might keep or how you keep it and how you make it accessible. So there are sensitivities, and so those need to be looked at.
But gender,
my advice is similar to Frode's in that as everybody who has been alive knows, but just to be reminded, is purposeful communication is the job of distinguishing what you want to say versus what you want somebody to know, and that should in large part be driven by what you want them to do. So if there are specific things that, like, potential steps, that's a really great thing for new entrants into the hypertext thing. It's like, oh, that could be my paper next year. If you could see half a dozen papers, what are those, and how can you spell it out so that, one, people know to do it, and two, they know to contact you so that you can get second author on it.
Yeah, because the funny thing is, I don't actually want to do. I've actually sort of got bored of this now. I mean, because we're really, part of the thing is saying, look, this is not difficult to do. I pointed out some of the problem areas. Now let's get more people, who have more skills than I don't to do this.
Yeah, but by showing the opportunities. But the whole thing about gender, people have different needs for what their identity, what part of their identity is important, right? Like, so gender is, of course, an important part of our identities, but there are many other aspects of it, nationality, religion, whatever it might be. So one recommendation might be that the papers will allow, in a basic, let's call it taxonomy, of the authors to choose what information to give up about themselves.
Mm-hmm.
Like right now, it may be interesting to know, in technology, a lot of people are in Ukraine. That would be worthwhile maybe seeing, and maybe seeing how things change. So to allow people to express that, but not to necessarily mandate it.
The interesting thing, funny enough, I've been down this rabbit hole from a different perspective, because one of the things that came up earlier is I said, oh, I noticed you haven't put in where people work for. And I said, well, and I thought, this sounds like someone who's never looked at the data again, because someone through their career may work at 5 or 6 different places.
But only one place when they author the paper.
Sorry?
But only one place when they publish the paper.
But yes, but what people want to do, what happens is we mentally elide the messy bit. So if I've worked in the field for 10 years and I've published 8 papers and I've worked in 5 different places and lived in 4 different countries, the metrics start to fall apart, and I'm working in a multinational team. So do we actually know? We normally assume the first author is really did all the work, but we don't really know. So you have to start making some value judgments, because when you want to know where did this really happen, well, it probably really happened in where the first author is. So all I'm saying is it's actually a lot more complicated, I think, than we tend to assume. So, and the problem comes that if you don't embrace that difficulty, just say it's difficult, we're going to have to deal with it. If you lowball it, you end up with all those things we read, and you scratch your head at the end. So
Mark,
that's a really interesting question, but I haven't learned anything.
It's not. Yeah, now it's almost like you're kind of boomeranging on yourself. Like this sentence in this book that I think is really good. The whole thing about how cultures. The whole beautiful sentence of the word is a coordination device. It's the same thing here. For instance, my paper will say University of Southampton. I'm not really there anymore.
Mm-hmm.
But, okay, look me up as a human being. Look what I'm doing. There are different data sets that can overlap because time is one thing. So the data set of an author's career is not the same as what should be in a paper. All I'm saying is that if an author wants to have certain things put in, they should be able to do that.
Oh, sure. Yeah, no, I think we're slightly cross purposes. What I meant was that what I've learned is it's very, once you start to collect information, it's very easy to ask questions that appear simple, which the data simply cannot
Absolutely,
support.
absolutely.
So one of the, I think this goes back to the conversation we we're having earlier about APIs, is where we all need to learn to be a lot more responsible, saying, you know, in a sense, if you put it in plain words, don't even try to do the following using this, because at best you'll get something, you know, you may get nothing, at best you get something, and that something will be wrong, and it will mislead you in a way that you don't understand.
Okay, Mark, you're going into a lot of tangents. You're overthinking this. You need to do your presentation. You need to decide on the sections. One is clearly going to be, look, amazing things can be done. I'm not saying you should use that title, but that's what you have, right? That's a really powerful section. And then there's the gotcha. No, you can't just click on ACM API and just get this stuff. It's not available. And here is what I suggest we do in the future.
I'm just wondering, actually, one actionable thing is I'm wondering from this discussion whether I should actually, after I've done the basic, you know, 2 or 3 graphs from the thing, is actually go straight to the visualizations.
Yes.
Before going into essentially the unintentionally negative bits. Yeah. Okay. Yep. No, I can do that.
Yeah.
Yeah. And like I'll hammer on this more. What do you want people to do, and how can you direct them to it? If there are next steps, if there are people you want to reach out to you, if there are specific directions of research that you don't want to do yourself, but you want other people to pick up on, how do you make that as appealing as possible and make it as clear as possible to
let me reflect it back in a way that you might be able to clarify, and that is, I think, so the conference is sort of owned insofar it's owned at all, really, by the special interest group, SIGWeb. They're all SIGs for the ACM. They're like sub affiliations, and I think but SIGWeb mainly owns it. And I think what I'm really wanting to do is to get people to to rethink how we do the sort of community volunteer part of this. So at the moment we're stuck in a sort of 1980s paradigm of you get kudos by being the track chair and you do this and you produce a book. Actually, for instance, if I was a young doctoral student, I was really interested in hypertext, maybe I'm the guy who should get involved in sorting out some of these data things and being maybe for a year or two being the temporary custodian. So that SIGWeb, maybe it's on SIGWeb servers, maybe it's not in the DLACM. It's saying to people, like, think flexibly. Think about how you can achieve things, and stop saying it can't be done because somebody else has to do it, which is the normal gatekeeping excuse. So we can't afford somebody to do this. Well, bollocks! You're in a room full of people who've flown halfway across the world to be here because they're interested in this. I don't believe that. I never have. You know, if you ask people, it's amazing what people will do, because actually it's aligned with what they're doing anyway. So I think that's what I'm trying to engender.
So what I want you to do, my dear, close, beautiful friend, Mr. Mark Anderson, is wait for this video transcript to be uploaded to the YouTubes.
Yeah.
Watch the last bit again of our discussion just now, and cut the piece where you answer Brandel's question. And I'm not kidding. From this video, put it in as the last 30 seconds to a minute. Don't even re-record it. Just say, and when asked by good friends, the point of this is what I said, and you just play it. What you said now encapsulated it flawlessly well.
Okay.
In fact, I will give you an edited video file of just that for ease, if you want to do that.
Actually, that would be, because I don't know what midnight Hawaii time is, but it's coming very fast.
All right, I will do that, and it's 2 minutes so let's finish now.
Yeah. And anyway, really jazzed about Brandel's news, which we didn't really got lost in the noise. So now I'm absolutely thrilled to hear that. Yeah,
it's so exciting, Brandel.
Yeah.
Now that you and Bruce Horn are both at Apple doing exciting things, it's almost letting me want to go to the crazy nation of America. Let's see what happens.
Yeah, I mean, not to sound bombastic about it, but I think it means good things for the web. I feel like I'll be able to be good for what the web is, in a way that, it's neat, but I think that there's some thinking that hasn't happened in the last while about holistically what it is that we'll be able to kind of hopefully make a dent in. I'm really excited by that.
There was a documentary about David Bowie today on Radio 4 as I was driving back from Tesla, and listening to him talking about his writing is good. He believed his writing was good. This is so important. And I think in these communities we have to, if we believe in each other, make that clear. And, the whole false modesty thing is such horrible, corrosive crap. So it's really nice to hear you say that, Brandel, and I fully agree. And I know that everyone else in the community completely agrees.
Yeah, and I think it's also it's a lovely opportunity. And I've been lucky myself in a complete different area in the past, in the sense of having the opportunity to be doing something at a time when there weren't enough people who figured out how to tell me not to do it yet.
Exactly.
And that's not, and you can't design these things, but that's why, in a sense, is what you said, you're being in the right place at the right time, and half that often is being the person who's just far enough ahead of the rest of the people that you can do it before they figured out what it is they should have stopped you doing.
Exactly.
Yes, absolutely.
On that note, have a great weekend.
Good luck, Mark.
Okay.
It sounds really exciting, and I look forward to how it goes.